These are a look at some of the teams that were eliminated, or all four of the teams, I should say, that were eliminated in last night's Sweet 16. And now joining me to break down the future of these teams and more is 24/7 Sports' Eric Bossi. E-Boss, welcome to the show. I actually want to start last weekend because for anybody who hasn't checked these out, they should head on over to 247sports.com. It's just a great look ahead at what these teams need to prioritize in the portal, in their spring recruiting efforts. And I want to start with a team that I candidly thought was still going to be playing when this season began, and that's Kansas. What, if you are Bill Self, do you think the Jayhawks should really be prioritizing this coming offseason?
You aren't the only one who thought Kansas was still going to be playing. They certainly had high expectations in the preseason. And, of course, they were ranked number one. But it is what it is, and what's happened is what's happened. And now there's one priority. Maximize the 1 year you're going to get out of Darren Peterson, our number 2 player in the class of 2025. That's it. It's that simple. Obviously, CBS analyst Hunter Dickinson is out. KJ Adams is out. DeJuan Harris is out after about 15 or 16 years. And Zeke Mayo is gone after a transfer year. So they've got a lot to replace right now. They've got Peterson coming in, and, you know, he's a dynamic guy. He can create off the dribble. He can get points in a hurry. He does everything. He has a legit chance to be an All-American as a freshman. So you've got to get around him the most talent. So you really need to go and find an athletic four-man who can score in the portal, maybe someone in the mold of a guy like Jalen Wilson that they had in the past. You've got Flory Badunga coming back, who should be better as a sophomore to offer some rim protection. You've got Bryson Tiller, who's been in the program for 6 months now after enrolling early. So you've got some pieces around them, you know. So that's going to be the point. And really, you've got to find a ball handler now, too, to go with Darren Peterson, because asking him to handle so much is really going to be a lot of him, even though he's up to it. But you've got to ease the pressure on him a little bit.
You know, Bossi, I made that exact point yesterday. I was talking to Michael Swain, who runs the Kansas site on the 24/7 Sports Network, and he's working on a story on this very subject as well, as what does Kansas need to surround DP with. And I said, I think it's a few things. To your point, I think they need a secondary ball handler, someone with on-off ball versatility, and then some spacing to open up the floor. Obviously, that comes in the way of shooting. Maybe they can retain some of the shooters they have. That'll wait and see. But I think so much of this, and I made a comparison to Duke. And I said, listen, Duke is a national championship contender in part because they've got 3 freshmen who are terrific who start. But then they surrounded them with the right vets, with guys who could take on the primary defensive matchups, with guys who can space the floor. Sion James, Tyrese Proctor have both had terrific seasons. That was a slip on my part because Hunter Dickinson was in studio with me here last night, right here in the HQ studios. We had a lot of fun. Let's turn the page and talk about Arizona. I thought they played about as well as they possibly could last night. They still didn't get the win, but it's going to be a little bit of a new era next season because Caleb Love is gone. They got a big commitment from Koa Pete yesterday. What else does Tommy Lloyd need to do now that he can focus entirely on roster construction?
Yeah, how about Arizona and the Caleb Love feel-good story that nobody saw coming at the beginning of the year, right? What a turn of events for him. Really glad to see that happen for him after taking a lot of heat over the last couple of years. You mentioned Koa Pete. He's a huge addition. They needed another frontline guy, especially with the status of Carter Bryant and whether or not he'll leave for the NBA after 1 year up in the air. But it's all really now about replacing Caleb Love as the number one priority. And as big as a get as Koa Pete was the other day, they're still angling for another guy that we're going to talk about a little bit more later. Braden Burry is a 6'5" combo guard out of California. He's the guy that they have ticketed to replace Love. They seem to be in a pretty good spot with him. We'll see, but he's the guy who would be ready to come in and play 30 minutes. But regardless of whether or not they get him, Jaden Bradley should be back for another year. He's developed into a really quality college point guard. And Arizona is going to be huge, man. Henry Visar is back. They're going to get Mochevas Krivas back from injury. Tobe Awaka, if he's back for another year, they're going to be able to throw a lot of size at guys that other people can't handle. And then you had Pete, too, as a versatile guy who can defend up and down the lineup. If Bryant is back, they're again going to be huge because that gives them a big wing who can shoot. So if you don't get Burries, you've got to find another ball handler, and you've really probably got to find another shooter. Relying on Anthony Dell'Orso to be the prime shooter for them is really asking a lot of him based on what he showed this year after coming over for Campbell. So get Burries done. Get a shooter, and if you don't get Burries done, you need to get a handler and a shooter.
All right, as you mentioned, we are going to have more on Braden Burry's recruitment coming up later. We're also going to have more on Carter Bryant's scenario later as we talk about some potential NBA draft prospects, so stay tuned for that. Want to ask you about John Calipari and Arkansas. Obviously, a disappointing loss in the way the second half went, and certainly all kinds of questions about late-game situations. But say what you will about Cal, this team rebounded in a huge way. He called it, I believe, the most rewarding season he's had, certainly in a long time. The other thing he said, and this didn't get quite as much attention a few days back, he said that if his guys enter the portal, they may not have the opportunity to return. So I wanted to ask you about that and what it could mean in terms of just the implications of what Arkansas's roster could look like next season.
Yeah, so Arkansas fans are going to get their first real taste of what it's like to have a John Calipari offseason. Last year was a blank slate where you just needed to find a team, right? Now they've got to figure out who's going out, who's going to the draft, who's going to the portal, who do we need to stay, who do we want to, kind of maybe gently usher out the door, because we got to make room for things. Because if you look at the recruits with Malik Thomas and Darius Acuff coming in, those are both pretty ball-dominant five-star guards. So if a guy like DJ Wagner isn't going to the NBA, how does he fit with those guys? Does Carter Knox come back? Does he play the 3, the 4? What's going to happen with Boogie Fland? He certainly would be kind of a strange fit with those guys if he chose to come back versus coming to the NBA. So it's really setting up some interesting dynamics between who stays, who goes to the portal, and then how do we respond from that?
It's such a good point about their backcourt because I think certainly in the first month of the season, Boogie was exceeding expectations. At least I'll speak for myself. He was exceeding my expectations. Travis and I have talked about this on the show, how we were aligned and thinking he was farther along earlier on than we expected. But then he goes down when the injury comes back, and his draft stock seems to have taken a hit. So just with the type of money that's being thrown around in NIL right now, I just don't know that it makes a whole lot of sense to go to the NBA unless you're a guaranteed first-round pick. But to your point, with Darius Acuff, Malik Thomas, maybe DJ Wagner, that is really crowded over there. And the one thing that none of those guys are is ball movers. They are all need the ball in our hands and scorers. So that is going to be a very interesting dynamic. Speaking of interesting dynamics, I want to ask you about BYU. Now, BYU made an inspired run, not just to the Sweet 16, but over the course of the last month in the season. Going into last night's game, they had won 11 of their last 12, only dropping the conference tournament game to Houston, and really just playing terrific basketball for Kevin Young, really living up to that pace and space philosophy that he promised when he got the job. Yegor Demon presumably going to go to the NBA draft. We know they have the commitment from AJ Debonsa, who's the number 1 ranked prospect. But that in and of itself is going to create a much different type of dynamic. Yegor Demon is maybe the best passer in the draft. AJ Debonsa is probably the best isolation scorer. Maybe it's debatable, but certainly that's like his archetype. So how does this impact how BYU builds the rest of next year's roster?
I think it's kind of similar to what you're looking at with Kansas with trying to build around Darren Peterson and maximize the 1 year that you have with him. But I think after seeing Kevin Young for a year, BYU fans and college basketball fans should have a lot of faith in this guy figuring it out. He came to Provo with a ton of hype of him being, the top assistant in the NBA. And he struggled a little bit early, understandable. But, man, the last couple of months, that guy has been in his bag. I've had so many coaches call me and tell me, hey, when BYU is on, I'm watching with a notebook because he's running stuff that I want to use. So you've got AJ, right? He's going to score. He's a big wing. He's an isolation guy. You've got a nice big piece in Kevin Keita, who's a rim roller, a lob finisher. He's going to do the dirty work on the glass. Richie Saunders is a shooter who has developed in a potential NBA-level wing. And you've got a couple more shooters in Trevin Nell and Dawson Baker and those guys around him. So you've got guys who can help space the floor around AJ. What you don't have is what you were talking about with Yegor Demon. You don't have a guy to move the ball around. So BYU has got to go out and find a point guard in the transfer portal, and he's got to be a guy who's ready to come in and play starter minutes at the Big 12 level with the understanding that it's, my job to set the table and feed all these scorers, particularly AJ.
Bossi, I will tell you, I'm fascinated to see if AJ can acclimate to the type of ball movement that we have seen from BYU, because if he can, I think it's going to unlock even higher level production than we've seen from him so far, and that would really be something special.